came into power as a critique of that, and Southerners Southern Confederates unwilling to accept that change, went to war with the Union.
So who was on each side? The Union and Confederates. What are we talking about? What are the states? How many people? What's like the demographics and the dynamics of each side?
The Union side is much, much larger, right, in terms of population. I think about 22 million people. And it is what we would today recognize as all the states basically north of Virginia. The South is the states in the south of the Mason-Dixon line. So Virginia and thereon south, west through Tennessee. So Texas, for example, is in the Confederacy. Tennessee's in the Confederacy. But other states like Missouri are border states. And the Confederacy is a much smaller entity. It's made up of about 9 million people, plus about 4 million slaves. And it is a agricultural economy, whereas the Northern economy is a more industrializing economy. Interestingly enough, the Confederate states are in some ways more international than the Northern states because they are exporters of cotton, exporters of tobacco. So they actually have very strong international economic ties, very strong ties to Great Britain. The United States was the largest source of cotton to the world before the Civil War. Egypt replaces that a little bit during the Civil War. But all the English textiles were American cotton from the South. And so it is the southern half of what we would call the eastern part of the United States today, with far fewer people. It's made up, the Confederacy is, of landed families. Wealth in the Confederacy was land and slaves. The northern United States is made up predominantly of small business owners and then larger financial interests, such as the banks in New York.
And what about the military? Who are the people that picked up guns? What are the numbers there? So the Union also outnumbered the Confederates.
By far, but it is a really interesting question because there's no conscription in the Constitution. Unlike most other countries, our democracy is formed on the presumption that human beings should not be forced to go into the military if they don't want to. Most democracies in the world today actually still require military service. The United States has very rarely in its history done that. It's not in our Constitution. So during the Civil War, in the first months and years of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln has to go to the different states, to the governors, and ask the governors for volunteers. So the men who take up arms, especially in the first months of the war, are volunteers in the North. In the South, they're actually conscripted. And then as the war goes on, the Union will pass the Conscription Acts of 1862 and 1863, which for the first time, and this is really important because it creates new presidential powers, for the first time, Lincoln will have presidential power to force men into the army, which is what leads to all kinds of draft riots in New York and elsewhere. But suffice it to say, the Union Army throughout the war is often 3 times the size of the Confederate Army.
What's the relationship between this no conscription and people standing up to fight for ideas and the Second Amendment? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We're in Texas.
Yeah, yes. So
what's the role of that in this story?
The American population is already armed before the war. And so even though the Union and the Confederate armies will manufacture and purchase arms, it is already an armed population. So the American presumption going into the war is that citizens will not be forced to serve, but they will serve in militias to protect their own property. And so the Second Amendment, the key part of the Second Amendment for me as a historian is the well-regulated militia part. The presumption that citizens, as part of their civic duty, do not have a duty to join a national army, Prussian style, but are supposed to be involved in defending their communities. And that's the reality. It's also a bit of a myth. And so Americans have throughout their history been gun owners, not AK-47 owners, but gun owners. And gun ownership has been for the purpose of community self-defense. The question coming out of that is, what does that mean in terms of, do you have access to everything? Antonin Scalia, even himself, asked this question on the Supreme Court. He said in one of the gun cases, you have the right to defend yourself, but you don't have the right to own an Uzi. You don't have the right to have a tank. I don't think they'd let you park a tank, Lex, in your parking spot, right?
Actually, I looked into this. I think there's a gray area around tanks. Actually, I g- I think you're legit allowed to own a tank.
Oh, you really?
I think there's somebody look into this. 'Cause somebody told me, but I could see like that because it's very difficult for that to get out of hand.
Right, right.
Okay, there may be one guy in a tank that you could be breaking laws in terms of the width of the vehicle that you're using to operate. Anyway, that's a hilarious discussion. But so to make the case, speaking of AK-47s and rifles, and back to Ukraine for a second, one of the fascinating social experiments that happened in Ukraine at the beginning of the war is they handed out guns to everybody, rifles, and crime went down, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
I hope somebody does a kind of psychological data collection analysis effort here to try to understand why. Because it's not obvious to me that in a time of war, if you give guns to the entire populace, anyone who wants a gun, it's not going to, especially in a country who has historically suffered from corruption, not result in robberies and assaults and all that kind of stuff. There's a deep lesson there. Now, I don't know if you can extend that lesson beyond wartime, though.
Right. That's the question. What happens after the war? I mean, my inclination would be to say that can work during war, but you have to take the guns back after the war.
But they might be very upset when you try to.
That's
take
the
guns.
problem. No, that's precisely the problem. That's actually part of the story here. I mean, what happens after the Civil War, after Appomattox in 1865, is that many Southern soldiers go home with their guns, and they misuse their weapons to, quite frankly, shoot and intimidate former slaves who are now citizens. And this is a big problem. I talk about this in the book in Memphis in 1866. It is former Confederate soldiers and police officers and judges who are responsible for hundreds of rapes within a 2-day period and destroying an entire community of African Americans. And they're able to do that because they brought their guns home.
But underneath the issue of guns, there is just the fundamental issue of hatred and inability to see other humans in this world as having equal value as another human being.
Yeah.
What was the election of 1860 like that brought Lincoln to power?
So the election of 1860 was a very divisive election. We have divisive, contested elections from 1860 really until 1896. The 1860 election is the first election where a Republican is elected president, that is Lincoln, but he's elected president with less than 40% of the vote because you have two sets of Democrats running, Democrats who are out to defend the Confederacy and everything, and then Democrats who want to compromise but still keep slavery. Most famous, Stephen Douglas, who argues for basically allowing each state to make its own decisions, popular sovereignty, as he called it. And then you still have traditional Whigs who are running. That was the party that preceded the Republican Party. So you have 4 candidates. Lincoln wins a plurality. Lincoln is elected largely because the states that are anti-slavery or anti-expansion of slavery are not a majority, but they're a plurality. And the other states have basically factionalized, and so they're unable to have a united front against him.
Was the main topic at hand slavery?
I think the main topic at hand at that time was the expansion of slavery into new territories.
Into new territory.
Right. It was not whether to abolish slavery or not. Lincoln is very careful, and his correspondence is clear. He wants no one on his side during the election to say that he's arguing for abolitionism, even though he personally supported that. What he wants to say is the Republican Party is for no new slave territories.
Did he make it clear that he was for abolition?
No, he was intentionally unclear about that.
What do you think he was throughout his life? Was there a deep... Because that takes quite a vision. Like you look at society today, and it takes quite a man to see that there's something deeply broken where a lot of people take for granted. I mean, into modern day, you could see factory farming. There's one of those things that in 100 years we might see as like the mass torture of animals could be seen as evil. But just to look around and wake up to that, especially in a leadership position. Was he able to see that?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I mean, the premise of your question is really important, that to us, it's obvious that slavery is a horror. But to those who had grown up with it, who had grown up seeing that, it was hard to imagine a different world. So you're right. Lincoln's imagination, like everyone else's, was limited by his time. I don't think Lincoln imagined a world of